Hey, you know what would be fun? Talking about how Batman never seems to have any permanent answers to the supervillain problem besides to put them in questionable carceral situations where he, Batman, can catch them again when they inevitably escape. Unfortunately, I've been informed this is in fact not 2009 anymore, and that has been done to death. So, we're going to talk about why Batman never seems to have any permanent answers to the supervillain problem besides to put them in questionable carceral situations where he, Batman, can catch them again when they inevitably escape. Hey, who put this definition here? Odd phrasing. I guess maybe some people are just predisposed to criminality, right? Or maybe, just maybe, there are some people with an incentive to construct a perpetual criminal underclass that only they have the power and authority to stop?
In Gotham?
We're not here to talk about Commissioner Gordon-Levitt. Why does Batman, who has faced gods and demons alike, never really stop crime in Gotham? Let's get into that. To address the obvious objections, of course Batman stops some crime, at least in some immediate causality. And I'm not going to pretend that Batman doesn't care about crime. I don't think he would do what he does were that the case. But perhaps in exploring these points, we can understand exactly what's going on with Master Bruce here.
Batman crafted his image by utilizing terror and fear as a weapon against the criminal element outside of the confines of the law. Batman's arrival changed the rules under which the city's criminals and law enforcement historically operated. Where before, criminals would maneuver freely around the law and the long-suffering cops who put on the GCPD badge, now doing so would run them straight into Batman. His arrival signaled that it was no longer necessary to operate within the boundaries of the law to police crimes. The only way to stop Batman was to kill him, something that Batman took great flair in proving impossible, as it only reinforced the terror he inspired in those that he pursued. This had the effect of making criminals hypervigilant, paranoid, and even more violent to counter Batman's overwhelming capabilities. If they wanted to remain in business, they would have to choose a more aggressive or insidious tactics to survive a man who did not care about police procedure and investigation. Like bacteria responding to a new antibiotic, the criminals of Gotham got tougher, smarter, and more crafty.
That's from an article called "The Hero Gotham Deserves. Is Batman Good for Gotham City?" Written in 2012! And, yes, by the dubs, the blank deserves bit was already cliched by 2012. But it's clear that getting hung up on the crime that Batman stops misses the larger point and, in many ways, obscures it. It's kind of like if there were massive protests going on, and the police decided to show up with tear gas and rubber bullets. The people who continue to show up are inevitably going to be ready to handle that escalation. And surely it's not too dissimilar to the militarization of police after 9/11 and the consequences of that.
In Gotham, this has zero correlation to anything in the real world.
So, it's not that Batman isn't strong enough, or that he doesn't have the right tech, or that qualified immunity doesn't go far enough. On the contrary, it's because of the stakes that Batman and the police escalate to that crime inevitably rises to match it. Brute force can't stop crime. It can only make it more cunning or reckless. We could talk for hours about the endless cycle of violent escalation, but that's only one small part of the issue here. Alienation, in Marxist terms, is a separation of the massive wage workers from the products of their own labor. This is one of the more intuitive positions in the Marxian framework, but its implications are perhaps more broad than you might think at first. You see, when you're alienated from what you do or what you create, then you're equally alienated from the people you engage with, who are also just cogs within this machine. And as most of our daily interactions exist within this market dynamic, we subconsciously reinforce it, even where it doesn't exist. Okay, but what does this have to do with Batman? Well, nothing. Not directly, anyway, but it does have a lot to do with Bruce Wayne. You see, alienation goes both ways, folks, because the owner is separated from the product. right? It only exists as a market exchange. There is no spiritual act of creation, only the callous thrift of old blood and new money. And in Bruce, this alienation is expressed in his own formative tragedy. Thomas and Martha's death not only exists as Bruce's personal trauma and motivation, but as a grim example of alienation. Bruce literally buried his connection to his wealth. He has no more spiritual bond to the largesse of Wayne Enterprises than anyone else there, especially not the workers. His parents, for whatever evils they did in the process, made that money, made that business. Bruce just has to manage it. But still, what does this have to do with cops?
In Gotham.
Because another side of alienation is the division of labor. For about 200 years of capitalist development, there is a pretty standard and effective model in play. The men worked and went to war, while the women maintained the home and reared the next generation of workers. But by the 1970s, this model was proving unsustainable and women were forced into the workplace. Now, this video isn't about a Marxist critique of first-wave feminism. There's way too much to even start on that. I'm only bringing this up because we need to talk about what effect it had on men.
In Gotham.
Toxic masculinity can be defined as a narrow and repressive description of manhood, designating manhood as defined by violence, sex, status, and aggression. So that's how we're going to define it. In this context, it should be easy to see how this all fits together. Our status as men was always legitimized by our domestic monopoly on violence and aggression, which allowed unrivaled sexual domination. When these structures start to fall apart, of course it would be preferable for men to change with them. But here's the thing about that. Things were working out pretty good for men. Even the lowest of us had someone beneath us. Now, of course, I'm not saying that police brutality is a reaction to feminism. We could also talk about how fascism mobilizes the middle class based on external threats to their interest, but that might be too on the nose. The takeaway here is that power reacts to threats to hegemony the only way it knows how to, by reinforcing the hierarchy wherever it can. Simply put, choke-slamming the kid selling loose cigarettes must feel pretty good when you imagine it's your estranged wife bragging about her raise.
In Gotham.
And with that in mind, it's easy to see why those with the power and authority to stop crime only ever curtail it, at best. Without crime, there's nothing to legitimize their authority. And without an endless quest for vengeance, personified in Batman, Bruce Wayne might have to confront his own alienation. Because inheritance is an illegitimate form of wealth. Stop me if you've heard this one. Batman doesn't kill. Which is a nice sentiment, but, maybe we should say Batman doesn't murder. That seems more accurate. If murder is premeditated killing, then I think it's fair to say that Batman doesn't kill with premeditation, and therefore doesn't murder. But do cops murder? Obviously those of us on the left would resoundingly say yes, but how do they see it? No matter how egregious, it seems that anytime an officer takes a life in the line of duty, there's some post hoc justification thrown out, some petty crime or act of resistance to excuse brute and lethal force.
In Gotham.
And here's a good one. Does Bruce Wayne kill? Obviously, if Batman does, right? But if he does, he certainly doesn't suffer the consequences of it. I mean, sure, Bruce might carry around the dying screams of every 2-bit jewelry thief he let fall to their death or whatever. That's between him and the old gods. The entity who would suffer any consequences is Batman. Likewise, the police
In Gotham.
hide behind their badges. They want the citizens to separate them as people and members of the community from the reality of their jobs. Just like Bruce clearly needs a place to compartmentalize his issues. But then, the whole fucking point of the all-time greatest Batman movie, Batman Forever, starring painfully underrated Val Kilmer, was that Bruce and Batman are one and the same, right? So what gives? Well, Bruce can think he's melded the identities all he wants to. Fact of the matter is, Batman isn't going to board meetings at Wayne Enterprises, and Bruce Wayne isn't chokeslamming Clayface. Bruce needs to believe that he occupies both of these identities at once, while at the same time needing Batman as a scapegoat for all the things his psyche can't bear. An equal dissonance can be found in the slogan Blue Lives Matter. You are expected to see the badge and gun as signifiers of a person's identity and character, while also accepting them as signs of professional authority. And there's something else here too. That little thing called qualified immunity. In the case of the police, it exists in the form of laws and judicial practices that keep them from facing any consequences. For Batman, it's because he wears a cowl, and his connection to the police. Also, being chummy with literal gods helps too in a pinch. But what about the people who don't have a rubber mask or a federal court to hide behind? What about the people who are profiled as being inherently and invariably criminal? Batman never has to justify his use of force against his opponents. They will always have to justify their existence outside of the cold grip of the justice system, not unlike our black and brown brothers and sisters and genders unlisted.
In Gotham.
Okay, but what's the point? Remember, we're trying to understand why Batman doesn't actually want to stop crime in a lasting sense. Well, if you were an isolated man-baby who had the chance to live out your most delusional fantasies with no material consequence and any psychological damage projected onto some perverse messianic reflection of yourself, it'd at least be tempting, right? In the eyes of the people of Gotham, Batman and the police are good, and the criminals, be they of white paint or black skin, are not. That's a compelling place to be in for a good guy, especially if you're trying to convince yourself of a narrative that your hard choices are vital to society, that the world couldn't go on without you doing what you do. Especially when, in the cracks of that perspective, you see glimpses of the truth of how weak, scared, and alone you really are. So what? Am I saying we need to cancel Batman? Far from it. I tend to agree with the thinking slime when they say we shouldn't surrender Batman to the far right. There are definitely ways to read the character that reinforce a more positive perspective. Though I don't think we can get around the billionaire thing, that's gotta go. I'm more interested in why Batman appeals to them, how they see their experiences reflected in his, and how they use his motivations as their own by proxy. Because I think alienation and the competitive nature of the system we live under will always create the necessity to enforce the hierarchy. Batman needs crime to continue because he needs a reason to justify being Batman. Without a reason to justify Batman, Bruce would have to confront his trauma without punching someone or deal with the consequences of his actions. He would have to be honest about what was done for justice and what was done for vengeance. For now, those are questions for Batman. And he's not talking. And maybe, if we stop looking at crime as a personal moral failing, and instead as a symptom of systemic poverty and the perpetuation of unjust hierarchy, we'll see ways to prevent and even eliminate crime that don't rely on force. Ways that don't invigorate some warped hero's journey in the minds of the oft-forgotten 21st century man. And maybe we have to confront our need to see the cycle of crime and punishment played out before we can ever have any hope of confronting it. I don't get it. Why are you guys asking about the police? Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. Thank you specifically to Emileigh with the G for lending her talents to this video. Link to her work in the box down below. Like and subscribe. Go to Patreon for hopefully some things, hopefully things you like. Go to Patreon for things you like. And to give us money.